When I first started thinking about the different things I wanted to offer as part of the Divine Feminist community, some friends of mine were pretty vehement that I should include a Storytime section. Initially, I kind of laughed at that idea because, first of all, it sounds a bit silly, and secondly, who wants to hear me tell stories? But the thing is, that's become a bit of a tradition with this particular friendship group. As you know, I'm a bit of a bookworm, which means that I often have a book recommendation on pretty much any subject on this Divine Feminist journey. And as part of that, there are often passages, different sections that really stick in my mind as having kind of touched me quite deeply. So with that in mind, we will often be midway through a conversation when I'll say, oh my goodness, there's a piece of a book that really links into this. Hold on. Off I'll scurry to my bookshelf and I'll come back and do a voice note of this particular paragraph, phrase, chapter, story, whatever it is. And every time I do that, these friends will always say, oh my goodness, it's so nice to have someone read a story to you. It filters in differently as you hear it. There's something really beautiful about that. So I sat with that idea for a while and realised that actually that tradition of oral storytelling, it's something that in many ways we've lost, isn't it? I mean, it's come back through podcasts, through radio shows, all of those things, but actually being told a story, it's one of my favourite things. I think that's why I love Audible so much. There's something really beautiful about it. And it's also a really good way of connecting in with those writers that we hold dearest, with those books that have most resonated with us on our journey. To hear their stories out loud, to have them read to us. There's something different about that, about the way that it sits in us, the way it settles in us, and the way that it finds us as it flows in, So with that in mind, that's something I'm going to do is every month as part of the Divine Feminist community, I will be doing a video just like this, which is a bit of a story time, a reading from one of my favourite books. My aim is that over time this will develop into a bit of a book club. I'll tell you what the book for that particular month's episode and theme is going to be early on, and we can discuss it and see how it resonates with each of us, where it flies, where it maybe sticks, and we can work through that as we go. But for now, the section I wanted to read to you in line with this week's episode on connecting with the earth was from Sharon Blackie's If Women Rose Rooted. And it's the story of the British sovereignty goddess, Elen of the Ways. You may recognise that word sovereignty or sovereignty goddess because it's something I talked about in the podcast when I was speaking about the old ritual of Hieros Gamos and how anybody who wanted to be a king of a land would need to marry the land, would need to take part in this ritual in which he came together with a sovereignty goddess of the land. Here in Britain, which is where these stories of If Women Rose Rooted are set, Elen was one such goddess, and this is her tale. The handsome and vigorous man who came to be known in Britain as Macsen Wledig was the Emperor of Rome, where he was called Maximus. One day, at the end of a meeting, he had called the 32 kings whose countries were subject to Rome's rule and suggested that they might all go hunting together the next morning. So at daybreak they set off together. Macsen and his kings, they rode through the cool, crisp air of the morning until they came to a green, wooded valley, through which ran the great river Tiber, and they hunted there till midday. By that time the sun was fierce and scorching, and so Macsen decided to stop and rest. His attendants gathered themselves around him and rested their shields on the shafts of their spears to shade him from the sun, and they placed a gold enamelled shield under his head. So Macsen slept. And in a fine stone castle, on a misty island far, far to the west, a weaver of dream paths cocked her head to the east and cast out a thread. As Macsen slept, he dreamed, and in this dream he was riding farther on along the valley they had hunted in, following the Tiber to its source. After some time he came to a mountain so high that it seemed to touch the sky. When he crossed over it and reached the other side, he looked down onto the most beautiful land that he had ever seen. Several mighty rivers flowed down the mountain and out to the sea, and Macsen travelled on along the banks of the largest of them. Finally, he came to a city by the coast, and in the centre of the city there was a vast and beautiful castle, with high towers of many different colours. And he saw a great fleet of ships at the mouth of the river, the largest fleet he'd ever seen. One of those ships was larger and fairer than all of the others. Half of it was made of gold and the other half was silver, and a bridge made of whalebone arced across the water from the ship to the land. Macsen dismounted from his horse and walked across the bridge and onto the ship, and as he stepped on board, the sail was hoisted and the ship began to sail across the ocean. On they sailed, and eventually the ship came to rest on the shore of the fairest island in the whole world. In his dream, Macsen travelled along the length and breadth of this country from sea to sea. He saw beautiful green valleys, great woods, towering mountains and rocky precipices. He had never seen an island so rich, so diverse in its landscapes. And then, finally, approaching the rugged, far western shore of this breathtaking land, he saw another island, a small way out to sea. Between him and the smaller island stretched vast green plains, surrounded by high mountains, and from the highest mountain of all, a great river flowed down through the land and spilled into the sea. At the end of the mouth of that river stood a castle, the finest Macsen had ever seen, and the door to the castle was open, so he went in. Macsen found himself in a magnificent hall. Its roof was made of silver, its walls of glittering precious gems, and the great double doors were made of gold. Golden seats and silver tables filled the hall, and in the centre of it 2 red-haired youths were playing a game which looked like chess. The game board was made of silver and the pieces on it were made of gold. The youths were clothed in jet black satin, bands of red gold encrusted with sparkling rubies and other fine gems bound up their hair. They had shoes of fine new leather fastened by buttons which were also made of gold. Beside a pillar at the far end of the hall was a grey-haired, clear-browed man, sitting in a chair of ivory with 2 golden eagles carved onto its back. The man, who gave the impression of immense power, had gold bracelets on his arms, many rings on his hands, and a golden torque around his neck. His hair was held back from his face with a golden diadem. A game board was laid out on a low table before him, and he held a rod of gold in one hand and a steel file in the other. Macsen saw that he was carving out pieces which looked like chessmen for the board. Next to him was a young woman, sitting in a great chair of red gold. She was so beautiful, so blindingly beautiful. She shone brighter than the midday sun, that Macsen could hardly bear to look at her. She wore a gown of white silk with gold clasps at her breast and an overdress of gold cloth. The gold circlet on her head was studded with rubies and gems and pearls, and a girdle of gold was wrapped around her small waist. In Macsen's dream, the woman rose from her seat. He walked towards her and took her in his arms, and then they sat down together in the great chair of gold. But just as he was turning to face her, into his dream crept the sound of dogs chafing at their leashes, and the sound of shields falling against each other, and the beating together of spear shafts as the canopy constructed by his attendants collapsed, and the neighing of horses, and the sound of men rousing themselves from sleep. And so the emperor awoke. But all he could think of was the beautiful woman in his dream, and the great love that he had felt for her. And so, with the saddest face and the heaviest heart in the world, he returned with his hunting party to Rome. For a full week, Macsen languished in his rooms. He didn't go out, or eat, or drink. No song or tale could interest him, and he couldn't be persuaded to do anything but sleep. For it was only in his dreams that he thought he might see her again. One day, Macsen's senior advisor told him that all of the members of his court, indeed all of the people of Rome, were whispering against him. "Why are they doing this?" Macsen asked, and his advisor said, "Because no one can get a word out of you, or an answer to a question, or a judgment on a matter of importance, and so they say you are no true lord." And Macsen said, "Bring to me the wisest men of Rome, and I will tell them why I'm so sorrowful and ask for their advice." The wise men of Rome were brought before the emperor. "In a dream I saw a woman," he said to them, "and for lack of her there is neither life nor spirit in me." Macsen told them the full story of his dream, and at the end of it the wise men answered, "Lord, this is our counsel, that you send messengers to the 3 directions of the world to search for the land and for the woman in your dream, for surely they may be found, and the hope of good news will comfort you in the months ahead." So Macsen sent out messengers, and they journeyed throughout the world for a year, seeking information about the land he had sailed to in his dream and the woman he had seen in the castle. But when the messengers came back to Rome, they knew no more than they'd known when they set out. Macsen was filled with sorrow, and a great wave of hopelessness descended on him. Then his senior advisor spoke to him again. "Lord," he said, "let us go out to hunt in exactly the same way you went on the day that you had your dream, and we'll see if you can trace the path that was laid before you." And so the emperor went out as if to hunt and came again to the green wooded valley of the great river Tiber. This is the place, he remembered, and then the details of his dream began to come back to him. This is where I was sleeping in my dream, and I followed the river westward to its source. This is where it begins, the path that was laid out for me in the dream. And so 13 messengers were sent out from that place at Macsen's command. Soon they came to a high mountain, and on the other side of it were vast plains and large rivers flowing from them. "Look," they exclaimed to each other, "this must be the land which the emperor saw." And as Macsen had instructed them, they travelled the full length of the greatest of the rivers till they came to its mouth at the sea. And there was the vast city, and the many-coloured high towers of the castle. The largest fleet in the world floated there in the harbour, with one ship that was larger and fairer than any of the others. And again they exclaimed, "Look, this is the place that the emperor dreamed." They took berths in the great ship and crossed the sea, and so it was that they came to the island of Britain. And they travelled across the island until they came to the great high mountain of Snowdon. Then they journeyed on until they arrived in the territory of Arvon, and saw the Isle of Anglesey laid out before them. "Look," they said to each other in wonderment, "here at last is the island the emperor saw in his sleep." They made their way finally to Macsen and to a great castle on the mouth of the river. The door of the castle was open, and they went in and entered into a marvellous rich hall. And there in the hall were 2 young men playing a game which looked like chess, and a grey-haired man in an ivory chair carving golden chessmen, and a beautiful young woman beside him, sitting in a chair of gold. The messengers knelt and greeted the woman, hailing her as the Empress of Rome. She frowned at them and said, "You look and behave as if you are honourable men, so why do you mock me?" But the messengers assured her that there was no mockery. "The Emperor of Rome himself has seen you in a dream, and now he has fallen in love and cannot live without you. So tell us, will you go with us to Rome and be made Empress?" And the young woman laughed at the messengers and said, "If it is true that the Emperor of Rome loves me, let him come here himself to find me." So the messengers hurried back to Rome and told Macsen that they had seen her. "We will be your guides, Lord," they said, "over sea and over land to the place where the woman you love lives. We know her name, we know her kindred, we know her race." And so Macsen set off at once. With his army at his back, they landed in the Isle of Britain, and Macsen conquered it, taking it from Beli, the son of Monoghan, and his sons, all of whom he drove back into the sea. After his conquests, he rode to Arvon, and there he recognised the castle from his dream. He hurried through its wide open door, and as he strode into the magnificent hall, there at its centre he saw Kynan and Edion, the sons of Wledig, playing the ancient game of destiny and divination. And he saw Wledig himself, the son of Caradoc, sitting on a chair of ivory, carving out golden men from his own golden game board. And there beside Wledig, sitting on a chair of gold, was his daughter, the maiden Macsen had seen in his dream. He knew now that her daughter was Elen. Macsen knelt before Elen and said, "Empress of Rome, all hail." And that night she became his bride. The next morning, as was customary, Elen asked Macsen for a wedding gift. He told her to name whatever she wanted, and he would see that it was done. So Elen asked to have the island of Britain for her father, all the land from the Channel to the island to the Irish Sea. She asked for the 3 adjacent islands for herself to hold under her title of the Empress of Rome. And she asked finally that 3 great castles should be made for her, in whatever places she might choose in the island of Britain. To all of this, Macsen agreed. Elen chose to have the greatest of her 3 castles built at Arvon, and Macsen stayed there with her, so that he would not be homesick. Earth from Rome was brought onto the site of the new castle, and after that the 2 other castles were built for her, at Caerleon and at Carmarthen. When the castles were finished, Elen looked around her and declared that she would create great roads which connected one castle to another, and which crossed the island of Britain. And so it was Elen who caused the great roads of the land to be built, and her army watched over her roads and used them to travel up and down the country to keep it safe. And that is why they are called Sarnau Elen, the causeways of Elen. For Elen was a native of this land, and the men of Britain would not have built such great roads for anyone other than her.